Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight's case is a little different. I was originally planning to cover a few stories, but this one didn't feel like it should be shared that way. Because April of this year marked 30 years since one of the darkest days in Australia's history, and some stories deserve to stand on their own. Tonight, we remember the victims of the Port Arthur massacre, and take a closer look at what really happened. As always, settle in, relax, and join me for True Crime in the Dark, with rain playing softly in the background, and continuing for a while after, for those of you drifting off to sleep. Before you do, let me know where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. In this case, we travel to Australia, more specifically to a place that for many years was known not for violence, but for its history. Port Arthur, located on the Tasmanian peninsula, just south of mainland Australia, it's a place surrounded by rugged coastline, quiet waters, and an almost eerie stillness. Today, it's known as a heritage site, somewhere tourists visit to walk through preserved ruins and learn about the past. But that past is a heavy one. Port Arthur began as a timber station in 1830, before quickly becoming one of the most notorious penal colonies in the British Empire. This was where the most hardened offenders were sent, men who had already been transported to Australia and committed further crimes. It was a place of punishment, isolation, and strict control, one of the harshest prison systems of its time. In 1877, the prison had closed its doors, and over time, the area slowly transformed. What was once a place of suffering became a place of reflection, and eventually a popular tourist destination. Families would visit, school trips would pass through, people came to learn, to take in the history, to enjoy the quiet beauty of the landscape. But on April 28, 1996, that quiet was shattered. Port Arthur became the scene of the deadliest mass shooting in Australian history.
Tonight's terror in Tasmania. It was the worst gun massacre ever. No words can express the horror and disbelief in this little Tasmanian tourist centre tonight.
The worst massacre by a single civilian in world history.
There is still no motive, no inkling as to why the gunman visited this horror on a quiet Tasmanian community. The sudden and appalling slaughter now added to the region's already dark history.
At the center of it all was a man named Martin Bryant. To understand what happened that day, we have to go back, long before the events at Port Arthur, and look at the life that led up to it. Martin John Bryant was born on May 7, 1967, in Newtown, a suburb of Hobart, Tasmania's capital city. He was the son of Maurice, a waterside worker, and Colleen, a homemaker. From a very early age, there were signs that Martin was struggling. He was slow to develop speech as a child, and as he grew, it became clear that forming relationships didn't come easily to him. His mother would later recall that he often displayed destructive behavior, breaking his toys deliberately, leaving pieces scattered around the house, almost as though he took some kind of satisfaction in the damage. School only made things worse. He attended the local primary school, where he quickly gained a reputation as difficult, disruptive, and different. He didn't enjoy being there, and the other children noticed. They mocked him, taunted him, and singled him out for his lack of social awareness. At one point, children would chant at him in the playground, "Silly Martin, no sense, no feeling." It's something he would later remember, telling a psychologist that no one wanted to be his friend. At home, his father tried to help in the only way he knew how. Hoping to give Martin a hobby, something to focus on, he gave him a pellet air rifle. But instead of helping, it seemed to deepen something darker. Martin would spend hours alone, using the rifle to shoot birds and small animals. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the way he carried it out. Witnesses would later describe how he appeared to take enjoyment in it, shooting birds from trees, then approaching them to finish the job at close range. As he moved into adolescence, his behavior escalated. He was suspended from school on multiple occasions for violence toward other students. and his parents, growing increasingly concerned, sought professional help. A psychological assessment revealed that Martin had an IQ of 66 and exhibited what were described at the time as schizophrenic tendencies. But even with that knowledge, there was no clear path forward. His parents tried. His father, in particular, made an effort to spend time with him, taking him fishing, going on long walks, trying to build some kind of connection. It didn't seem to make a difference. High school brought more of the same, only more intense. Martin became known among students as the Shadow, a nickname given because of the way he would silently approach people from behind, sometimes startling them, sometimes attacking without warning. There was something unpredictable about him, something that made others uneasy. Later, forensic psychologist Paul Mullen would describe this kind of behavior as a response to deep feelings of helplessness, a need to regain control, to build self-esteem in the only way he knew how, by intimidating or hurting others. One teacher would later say there was a sense of resentment building in him, something that seemed to grow stronger over time. The only moments where Martin appeared calmer were when he was working alone, in subjects like art or woodworking, places where he didn't have to interact, didn't have to navigate social situations he didn't understand. But outside of school, his behavior continued. Around Port Arthur, Martin became known as an unsettling presence. He would wander for hours, either riding his bike or walking aimlessly through the area, often around the very ruins that would later become central to the story. He was eventually banned from the Broad Arrow Cafe, a small, popular spot near the Port Arthur jetty, after repeated incidents involving his behavior. Locals reported him firing his air rifle at passing vehicles, spitting at people, creating a general sense of discomfort wherever he went. In 1987, at the age of 19, Martin befriended Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey. Helen was an eccentric and reclusive lottery heiress, living in a large, cluttered property filled with animals, dozens of cats, dogs, a chaotic environment that matched her equally unpredictable personality. She hired Martin to maintain her gardens, and the two quickly became close, unusually close. Before long, Helen invited Martin to move in with her, and from that point on, they were rarely seen apart. They spent money freely, on clothes, cars, meals, living a lifestyle that raised eyebrows among neighbors. But alongside that, there were warning signs. Neighbors reported seeing Martin wandering the property with his air rifle, acting as though he was guarding it, sometimes firing at passing motorists. There was a growing sense that something wasn't right. Their relationship itself was volatile. Helen would later tell people, half joking, half serious, "One of these days, that little bastard is going to kill me." She described moments where Martin would suddenly become aggressive, even grabbing the steering wheel while she was driving, causing multiple crashes. She adapted by driving more slowly whenever he was in the car, as though constantly trying to manage the risk. And yet, despite all of that, she named him as the sole beneficiary of her estate. Martin, in turn, would make unsettling comments to neighbors, joking about how he wished she would die sooner, so he could inherit her wealth. To those around him, it felt like he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, and then something happened that seemed to push him closer. In October 1992, Helen and Martin were involved in a serious car crash. Helen's vehicle veered into oncoming traffic. She was killed instantly. Martin survived, but suffered significant injuries, spending 7 months in hospital recovering. There were suspicions, questions were raised, but ultimately, nothing could be proven, and the case was closed. Martin inherited Helen's estate, around $550,000. Because of his condition, his parents were appointed as trustees, but the money was his, and things began to shift. Not long after, another tragedy followed. In August 1993, Martin's father, Maurice, disappeared from the family property. A note was found pinned to the door, "Call the police." When officers arrived, they found Martin outside, calmly mowing the lawn, seemingly unaware that anything was wrong. Maurice's body was later discovered in a nearby dam. He had drowned. The death was ruled unnatural, but not suspicious. Once again, Martin inherited. And now, with the sale of Helen's farm and his father's assets, he found himself close to being a millionaire. Over the next few years, his life changed on the surface. He began traveling, visiting places like the United States, Japan, and New Zealand. He bought expensive clothes, tailored suits, trying, it seemed, to reshape his image. At one point, he even adopted a surfer-style look, growing out his blonde hair, buying a surfboard, although in reality he rarely used it. To those who saw him from a distance, it might have looked like a new beginning, but underneath, very little had changed. As the years went on, Martin tried in his own way to build some kind of normal life. He attempted to form romantic relationships, something that had always been difficult for him, but none of them lasted. Conversations would fall flat, connections would fade quickly, and the same pattern would repeat itself over and over again. Each failed attempt seemed to deepen the sense that he didn't quite fit anywhere. Combined with the loss of the two people he had been closest to, his father and Helen, that sense of isolation only grew stronger. Around town, people had already begun to distance themselves from him. There were increasing concerns about his behavior, particularly his attempts to approach and interact with much younger children. Locals became wary. Parents took notice. He was warned more than once to stay away from a nearby Catholic girls' school after being seen loitering around the grounds. To Martin, it only reinforced what he already believed. He would later tell a psychiatrist that whenever he tried to be friendly, people would turn away, that it felt like everyone was against him. He was prescribed a tricyclic antidepressant in an attempt to manage what were described as severe mood swings, periods of agitation, restlessness, and emotional instability. But whatever internal struggles he was experiencing, they didn't ease. If anything, something else began to take their place. It was around this time that Martin developed an interest in firearms. Not casual interest, but deliberate, growing collection. He purchased an AR-10 semi-automatic rifle through a newspaper advertisement, then later a Colt AR-15, an L1A1 self-loading rifle, a USAS-12 automatic shotgun. One by one, the weapons accumulated, each purchase adding to something that at the time didn't fully raise alarm, but in hindsight feels deeply unsettling. At the same time, his thinking appeared to shift in other ways too. He became fixated on a local couple, David and Nolene Martin, who owned a small bed and breakfast called Seascape, not far from Port Arthur. It was a property his father had once hoped to buy. According to Martin, his father had been deeply upset when the Martins purchased it instead, believing the opportunity had been taken from him at the last moment. Over time, that disappointment seemed to evolve into something more personal in Martin's mind. He came to believe that the couple had deliberately acted against his family, that they had somehow caused his father distress, even contributing to his eventual death. Whether those beliefs had any grounding in reality didn't seem to matter. They stayed with him, and investigators would later consider this fixation, this grievance, as one of the factors that may have pushed him closer to what was coming. On the morning of Sunday, April 28, 1996, something about Martin's routine changed. He woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of an alarm clock. This alone was unusual. According to his girlfriend, who had been staying with him at the time, Martin didn't typically use alarms. He didn't keep to strict routines. But that morning he did. The two of them had breakfast together around 8 a.m. It seemed normal, quiet, uneventful, and then not long after, she left. What happened next unfolded in a series of small, deliberate steps. Once alone, Martin took out a large blue sports holdall and began placing his firearms inside. Carefully, methodically, he carried the bag out to his yellow Volvo, placing it on the back seat. His surfboard, something he rarely used, was still strapped to the roof of the car. And then he drove. On the way toward Port Arthur, He made several stops. At the first petrol station, he purchased a cigarette lighter. At the second, he bought fuel, a 15-liter container of gasoline, along with a cup of coffee. He lingered there for a while, sitting and drinking it slowly, chatting casually with the attendants. He told them he was heading out to surf. It struck them as odd. The sea that day was calm, flat, not the kind of conditions surfers would usually be heading toward. But nothing about the conversation on the surface seemed alarming enough to question further. From there, he continued on. He made one more stop, at a supermarket where he purchased a single item, a bottle of tomato sauce, and placed it in the back seat alongside the hold-all of weapons. Why he bought it, what he intended to do with it, has never been fully explained. At approximately 11:45 a.m., Martin arrived at Seascape, the same property his father had once wanted, the same place he had come to resent. He forced his way inside, carrying the Colt AR-15 from his bag. Inside the home were David and Nolene Martin. What followed was quick, controlled, and deeply violent. He struck Nolene with the rifle, knocking her to the ground. He restrained David, gagging him before taking a knife from the kitchen. He stabbed him multiple times, and then shot them both at close range. Afterwards, he washed his hands in the kitchen sink. The ordinary act in the aftermath of something so violent adds a kind of quiet, unsettling weight to what had just taken place. He then moved through the property, taking firearms that belonged to David, before eventually making his way back outside. Around 40 minutes later, as he was locking the front door and returning to his car, a young couple arrived at the property. They believed he was the owner. They approached him casually, asking if they could view one of the rooms. At first he ignored them, continuing to move items into the back of his vehicle. When they pressed again, he gave a strange response, telling them they couldn't go inside because his parents were away and his girlfriend was resting. There was something about his tone, his manner, that made them uneasy. They left, drove away, and only later, when they saw his face on the news, did they realize just how close they had come to something unthinkable. Meanwhile, just a short distance away, Port Arthur was beginning its day. It was a Sunday, the weather was good, and the site was busy, exactly as you'd expect for a popular tourist destination. Families arrived, tour groups stepped off coaches, staff moved quickly between tasks, preparing for what was shaping up to be a particularly busy afternoon. One staff member would later recall that by late morning, it was already clear they were dealing with higher numbers than expected. By early afternoon, the site was full, and into that crowd, Martin drove. He arrived at Port Arthur at around 1:30 p.m., pulling into the car park where visitors were being directed by staff. One of those staff members, Ian Kingston, briefly spoke with him. At first, Ian didn't recognize him, but something about him seemed familiar. Then it clicked. He remembered Martin from years earlier, from incidents around the Broad Arrow Cafe. Martin asked if he could park closer to the jetty. Ian told him no. The area was already full, with coaches lined up. Martin didn't argue. He simply got back into his car and drove further down, parking among the buses anyway.
20 years ago, on the day I was standing basically where we are now, and I was directing cars into their parking locations, and the yellow Volvo came down the street. I watched him come down. I pulled him up here and I talked to him. I viewed his entry ticket on his seat, and I asked him to park around to the right under these oak trees because it's pretty busy that day. It's over 1,000 people here. And we had 14 coaches booked in for the day. And coaches park over near the water's edge, used to. So the gunman decided that he wanted to park near the coaches, the water's edge. He wouldn't listen to me.
It was a small moment, easily overlooked, but it would be one of the last normal interactions before everything changed. For a brief moment, everything still appeared ordinary. Martin remained seated in his car for around half a minute after parking. Then slowly, he stepped out. From the back seat he took what looked like a golf bag-style holdall, adjusting it over his shoulder as though it were nothing unusual, and began walking toward the Broad Arrow Cafe. Inside, the lunchtime rush had just passed. The atmosphere had softened into that quiet lull that follows a busy service. There were still around 60 people inside, some finishing meals, others browsing the adjoining gift shop, families lingering a little longer before continuing their day. It was calm, unremarkable. Martin walked in, ordered food, and took a seat outside on the balcony area at the front of the cafe. For a while, he simply sat and ate like any other visitor. Then, he began to speak. To the people seated nearby, he made a strange, almost offhand comment about there being a lot of wasps around today. Investigators are still unsure if this was a comment about actual wasps, or if he meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. A short time later, he spoke again, this time commenting on the lack of Japanese tourists that day.
He said there's a lot of wasps around today, there's not many Japs here, are there? And then started muttering to himself, and then walked inside, and that's when all the gunshots started going off.
It was odd, but not enough to raise an alarm, not yet. After finishing his meal, Martin stood up, carried his tray back inside, and placed it down. Then, without drawing attention, he set the large blue holdall onto a table. And in a matter of seconds, everything changed. He opened fire. The sound was sudden, sharp, and completely out of place. At first there was confusion. People didn't immediately understand what they were hearing, but that confusion turned to panic almost instantly. People dropped to the floor. Some tried to run. Others froze. Many instinctively lay still, hoping not to be seen. The small cafe filled with chaos and smoke and fear. Among those inside was 29-year-old Jason Winter. In those first moments, as Martin approached, Jason made a split-second decision. He grabbed a tray and threw it towards him. This was an attempt to distract him to protect his wife Joanne and their infant son. He was shot and killed instantly. Joanne, shielding their 15-month-old son Mitchell, stayed where she was, hiding, trying to keep him quiet. It was later said that she softly sang to him the Barney theme tune song, "I Love You," anything to keep him calm, anything to keep him from making a sound. Another man, 44-year-old Anthony Nightingale, tried to confront what was happening. He stood, shouted out, "Not here," but there was no reasoning with what was unfolding. He too was shot dead. Inside the cafe, Martin moved slowly, not in panic, not in urgency, but with a chilling calmness. He walked through the space, firing at anyone who moved, often shooting from the hip. There was no pattern, no warning, just indiscriminate violence. In a matter of moments, the same place that had been filled with conversation and laughter was reduced to something almost impossible to comprehend. Among those caught in it were Carolyn Lawton and her 15-year-old daughter, Sarah. They had been sitting together, enjoying a late lunch when the shooting began. Carolyn would later describe those first seconds, the confusion, the disbelief, seeing pieces of the wall breaking apart, hearing the sound of gunfire, and then realizing, almost all at once, that they were trapped inside with a gunman. There was no time to react the way you might expect. No shouting, no dramatic escape. Just seconds. People either fell or lay still. At one point, Martin moved behind them. Carolyn could hear shots being fired just behind her in the gift shop area. Sarah saw it too, and in that moment, she stood up. Carolyn saw the look on her daughter's face. Pure fear. Instinct took over. She lunged forward, pulling Sarah down, wrapping her arms around her, trying to shield her as they dropped to the floor together. Carolyn survived, but unfortunately her daughter did not.
She stood up, in essence, in front of him, and he was shooting people behind me. She would have seen those people fall. I didn't. And the look of sheer and utter fear on her face was terrifying. I saw him come up behind her. I took one step and I lunged at her to drop her to the floor. Then we were both on the ground. When he walked past, he shot me in the back and he shot her in the back of the head.
Within minutes, it was over. Inside the Broad Arrow Cafe, 20 people had been killed. 15 more were seriously injured. Outside, the sound of gunfire had begun to spread confusion. Ian Kingston, who had directed Martin earlier in the car park, heard the shots and immediately began trying to move people away from the area. But not everyone understood what was happening. Some tourists, including groups who had just arrived, believed it was some kind of reenactment, part of the historical site. They moved closer, trying to see, and then Martin stepped outside. Those who saw him described how he raised the rifle and fired across the open area toward the penitentiary buildings. The reality of the situation began to settle in, and the panic outside quickly followed. People scattered. Some ran. Others dropped to the ground. Many didn't know where to go. At the same time, others ran toward the danger. Lynn Beavis, who was a nurse, had been nearby. She saw Martin leave the cafe and made a decision to run inside, not knowing what she would find, only that people may need help. But what she walked into was something she would later struggle to describe. Bodies everywhere. Silence broken only by those who were still alive. She would later say that as a nurse, she had seen death before. She had seen injuries, trauma, things most people never have to witness. But this was different. This was something she said only a soldier might understand. One moment stayed with her more than anything else. A woman approached her, searching, asking if she had seen her daughter. She's wearing a black hat, she said. Lynn knew. But she couldn't say the words. How could she tell a mother that her daughter was dead?
It was so quiet, not a bird, nothing, no sound at all. And I was laying there telling my sister how scared I was, how I didn't want to die. And I thought about those people laying there and thought maybe if they were bleeding I could help. I saw a young man sitting there, just sitting there with blood all over his hair and his face, holding his girlfriend, wife, I don't know, his hand, and she was very dead. And I just looked at him and I said, I'm so sorry. I can't help you. Being a nurse, I've seen dead people, I've seen blood, I've seen things like this, but what I saw in there, nobody but perhaps a soldier would know what it was like. It was, it was awful. But I now look at it and think I wish I'd never gone into that cafeteria.
Outside, the day that had begun like any other continued to unravel. Outside the cafe, the horror didn't stop. As people fled in every direction, hiding behind cars, ducking low, trying to make sense of what was happening, Martin stepped out and continued firing into the crowds. In those moments, 4 more people were killed, and several others were seriously injured. There was no pause, no hesitation, only movement and fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, He got back into his car. He switched weapons, exchanging the Colt rifle for the L1A1 self-loading rifle, and calmly began to drive away from the historic site, leaving devastation behind him. But he wasn't finished. As he drove along the road toward the Port Arthur jetty, he was flagged down by a woman. 36-year-old Nanette Mikak stood with her 2 young children, believing, like so many others, that this man was simply another person trying to escape what had just happened. Martin pulled over. What followed was almost impossible to comprehend. He forced Nanette to her knees and shot her in front of her children. A witness later described how he spoke to her, telling her to get down while she begged for her children's lives. After shooting her, he moved toward where the children were, deliberately ensuring there were no survivors.
It was here, as the gunman drove out of the park, that he shot dead a mother and her 2 children, sisters aged 3 and 6.
Police came across the body of a woman and her 3-year-old daughter lying on the roadway, and the body of the 6-year-old daughter was behind the tree.
He then drove on. A short distance further down the road, he came across a gold BMW stopped near a toll area. Inside were 4 people, 2 couples traveling together. There was a brief moment, an interaction, and then he opened fire. All 4 were killed. He dragged their bodies from the car, placed his own equipment inside, and set off again, now driving the BMW, abandoning his yellow Volvo behind. Not long after, he encountered another vehicle, a white Toyota Corolla. Inside were 20-year-old Glenn Pierce and his girlfriend, 28-year-old Zoe Hall. Martin stopped them. He approached with the rifle, opened the passenger door, and attempted to force Zoe out. Glenn tried to intervene. He didn't stand a chance. At gunpoint, Glenn was forced into the trunk of the BMW. And as he was locked inside, Martin turned his attention back to Zoe. She tried to escape. She was killed. Now with a hostage trapped in the car, Martin drove back toward the Seascape guest house, the same place where, earlier that day, this had all begun. When he arrived, he forced Glenn out of the trunk and into the building, handcuffing him to a stair rail. Then he went back outside. He fired at a passing motorist. He set fire to the BMW, and within minutes, police began to arrive. Officers responding to reports of gunfire were met with shots as they approached the property, forced to take cover as Martin fired from inside. Backup was called. Specialist units moved in, and what followed was a tense and drawn-out standoff that would last for hours. Inside the building, Martin remained barricaded. He spoke to negotiators, at times using a false name, at times rambling, at times completely detached from the reality of what he had done. Outside, police worked carefully, aware that he was armed, unpredictable, and that there was still a hostage inside. As the night stretched on, there was no resolution, no surrender, only silence, broken occasionally by gunfire. Then, in the early hours of the following morning, everything shifted. The building caught fire. It's believed Martin himself started it. Flames began to spread rapidly through the guest house, smoke pouring into the sky as emergency services scrambled to respond. And then, through the smoke, he emerged, burned, disoriented, unarmed. He was taken into custody immediately and transported to the hospital for treatment.
The person has been taken into police custody, conveyed to the Royal Albert Hospital, suffering from burns, no gunshot wounds.
The killer was taken by ambulance to Hobart Hospital, under police guard and with his head covered. He'll appear in court as soon as doctors allow.
Hospital staff have been praised for the way they coped with the emergency, management denying rumours that some nurses...
When the fire was finally extinguished, investigators made their way inside. What they found was devastating. Glenn Pierce had been killed during the standoff. The exact moment was unclear. And inside the ruins, they also discovered the bodies of David and Nolene Martin, the owners of the guest house, murdered earlier that day before Martin had even arrived at Port Arthur. When it was all over, the scale of what had happened became clear. 35 people were dead. 23 more were seriously injured. In the days that followed, Australia and the world struggled to process it. The sheer randomness, the brutality, the speed at which it had unfolded, it left people searching for answers that never truly came. Martin's motives were never fully explained. Some pointed to the earlier dispute over the seascape property. Others drew comparisons to the Dunblane school shooting in Scotland just weeks before. But when questioned directly, Martin offered nothing of substance. At times he appeared almost detached from it all. When asked why he had done it, he reportedly smiled and said he'd like to help, but couldn't. When told how many people had died, he simply nodded and said, "It's sad, isn't it?" There was no emotion behind it, no weight, just words. The public reaction was immediate and fierce, and in response, the Australian government introduced sweeping gun law reforms, restricting access to firearms and banning certain weapons entirely. Those laws still remain in place today. On November 22, 1996, Martin Bryant was sentenced. 35 life sentences, plus an additional 1,652 years. He will never be released. And yet, even with that outcome, it doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't bring anyone back. What remains is the memory of those who were lost, the families who were changed forever, and the quiet, haunting reality that a place once filled with history became the setting for one of the darkest days Australia has ever known. For many years, it was widely believed that Martin Bryant never gave a clear motive for what he had done. He laughed in interviews, avoided direct answers, and when he did speak, it often felt disconnected, as though he was talking about something that had happened to someone else. But over time, more information began to surface. Leaked psychiatric reports, interviews conducted just days after the massacre, slowly painted a clearer and deeply unsettling picture of what may have been driving him. At the center of it all was a grudge, a long-standing resentment toward David and Nolene Martin, the owners of the Seascape guest house. Bryant believed they had deliberately outbid his father for the property years earlier, something he blamed for his father's decline and ultimately his death. In his mind, this wasn't just business, it was personal. But that alone doesn't explain what followed, because alongside that anger, there was something else. A desire for power, for recognition, for control. He admitted that carrying guns made him feel powerful, like he was finally in charge of something. And before the massacre, he had reportedly told someone, "I'll do something that will make everyone remember me." Underneath all of that was a deep and persistent loneliness. Bryant spoke about how people didn't like him, how he felt rejected, isolated, pushed to the edges of every social space he tried to enter. At one point he said, "All I wanted was for people to like me." And then there was influence. Just 6 weeks before Port Arthur, the Dunblane massacre took place in Scotland. Bryant had become fixated on it, following the news coverage closely, absorbing every detail, and somewhere in that time, something shifted. What may have once been thoughts of self-harm appeared to evolve into something far more catastrophic, a plan. Taken together, these elements don't excuse what happened, they don't justify it, but they do reveal something deeply disturbing, that this wasn't a single moment of rage, it was something that had been building, quietly, over time. In the years since, Bryant has attempted to take his own life multiple times. He lives in isolation. His only consistent visitor is his mother.
His only visitor is his mother, Carleen. Martin is in jail. He will never be free, will he?
No.
Who will visit him when you're no longer around?
Probably nobody.
And his psychological condition, his mental state, what's he like?
That's confidential. Even if I knew, I couldn't talk about it. All I can say is that Martin was diagnosed about 3 years ago. as having Asperger's syndrome. And he's happy where he is at the moment. And Martin always, when he was questioned, probably for weeks before I saw him again, he always said he was never in Port Arthur at Broad Arrow.
And you believed him?
Yes. There's no evidence that Martin was there.
But none of that was needed because Martin said in court, yes, I did it. And you went along with it.
Exactly.
And now you wish you hadn't.
Of course, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. A lot of people on that day came forward after, and people who knew Martin had known Martin for years. And they said, as far as they were concerned, they didn't recognise the gunman as being Martin Bryant.
So many people would be very upset to hear you deny that this happened as people understand it happened. What do you say to them?
But there's also a lot of people that realise that Martin didn't have a trial and that there was no evidence proven whether he was the gunman.
Inside prison, the image of him is very different from the one the world saw in 1996. Former officers have described him not as powerful, not as feared, but as insignificant. A nobody within the prison system, someone who sits at the very bottom of the hierarchy.
Pretty much a nobody inside prison. He kept to himself, didn't communicate. He was not considered a risk and very, very low on the pecking order.
They describe him as childlike, socially awkward, often behaving in ways that others find unsettling.
The problems, I think, throughout Bryant's life is that he looked an intelligent kid, an intelligent adolescent, and an intelligent adult, but he wasn't.
In the unit, he was last known to be housed by himself in the Mersey unit. So that's a maximum security high dependency unit. There may be prisoners in that unit that wouldn't even know who he was. It's not a blip on the radar, which surprises a lot of people.
He has been targeted by other inmates, particularly because many of his victims were women and children. As a result, he has spent much of his sentence separated from the general population, in protective custody. Over time, the attention around him faded, and in the words of some who have worked there, he became a shadow.
People use the term dangerous prisoners, and there are dangerous prisoners, but there are also dangerous criminals who aren't dangerous prisoners. He doesn't communicate, very rarely. I've probably had half a dozen words with him over a 10-year period. Just his mentality. He's like a big baby. He's ignored, not feared, probably laughed at more than anything. He has a love of chocolate, but to get extra chocolate he had to do certain favours, and those favours were of a sexual nature to other prisoners who were being housed. It's common knowledge, yeah. He's not the smartest tool in the shed now.
But while his life has narrowed into confinement and obscurity, the impact of what he did has never faded. What began as a quiet Sunday became one of the darkest days in Australia's history. 35 lives lost, dozens more changed forever, families broken, communities reshaped by grief. Today, the site of the Broad Arrow Cafe stands not as it once was, but as a memorial, a place of reflection, a place where names are remembered, not numbers. And this year marks 30 years since that day. 30 years since lives were taken in an instant. And for the families left behind, 30 years of carrying that loss forward. This video isn't about him. It never really was. It's about the people who were there that day, the lives they lived, the families they belonged to, and the memories that remain. So tonight, as the rain continues, take a moment to think of them, because they deserve to be remembered. And before we close tonight's episode, I'd like to take a moment to remember those who lost their lives. I'm going to leave you now with their names, so they can be heard and not forgotten.
We're here today to recognise the past and reflect on the past, and also talk about the future. One part of recognising the past is to recognise the 35 people who passed away on this day in 1996. I'd like to read those names out to you. Winifred Joyce Applin, Walter John Bennett, Nicole Louise Burgess, Su Ling Chung, Elva Rhonda Gaylord, Zoe Ann Hall, Elizabeth Jane Howard, Mary Elizabeth Howard, Mervyn John Howard, Ronald Noel Jurry, Tony Vardavelu Kiston, Leslie Dennis Lever, Sarah Kate Lawton, David Martin, Nolene Sally Joyce Martin, Pauline Virginia Masters, Alana Louise Mikak, Madeline Grace Mikak, Nanette Patricia Mikak, Andrew Bruce Mills, Peter Brenton Nash, Gwenda Joan Neander, William Zing Ng, Anthony Nightingale, Mary Rose Nixon, Glenn Roy Pears, Russell James Pollard, Jeanette Kathleen Quinn, Helene Maria Salzman, Robert Graham Salzman, Kate Elizabeth Scott, Kevin Vincent Sharp, Raymond John Sharp, Royce William Thompson, Jason Bernard Winter.